Welcome to Venture in the South. These are the stories of innovation and success in the southern U.S. that make money, have fun, and do good.
It's Monday, June 16th, and I'm David, bringing you the notable in venture this week, and then an interview with Karl Rabago, an independent electric utility and grid expert. We'll be talking about energy demand versus supply for data centers and how it can affect the entrepreneurial success of data center development. Both hyperscalers and individual entrepreneurs are in a virtual frenzy to develop data centers, and both groups rely on developers to solve the problems and to take on the risks of development. It's created a gold rush of sorts with all the market distortions one might expect in a race for riches. The reward for the hyperscalers, contracted developers, is a big payout at completion, or even better, for owner-developers, a long-term recurring revenue stream with very attractive margins. It's become the Wild West of energy. Next week, we'll be talking about how AI is accelerating robotics into the venture economy to take on manual work. Now, to the week in venture. First, my favorite, the AI bubble watch. OpenAI announced it had reached a 10 billion ARR run rate as of June this year, almost exclusively on the back of ChatGPT subscriptions. But OpenAI's valuation has expanded even faster, projected at 300 billion from current fundraising talks, and implying an enormous revenue multiple of 30x. This suggests that investors are expecting even faster growth and an ever-expanding AI market. One big red flag, though: OpenAI will reportedly have a negative cash flow of about $9 billion for 2025 and does not expect to achieve positive cash flow until around 2029. So, applying some simple math, the $9 billion negative cash flow for 2025 plus the approximately $10 billion in revenue that was burned as well implies an annual burn rate of $19 billion. Thus, to get to a paltry 15% profit margin for 2025, OpenAI would have needed approximately $65 billion in ARR, a 7.2x increase over their actual results for the trailing 12 months. Of course, if profitability is not achieved until 2029, as forecasted, the ARR would need to be even greater due to likely further increase in valuation and additional operating expense. So the actual bet is that OpenAI can get to something like $100 billion in ARR by 2029. They are clearly interested in other product offerings beyond ChatGPT, but if that is the main product, then a third of the Earth's population will have to subscribe by the end of the decade. And then there are competitive offerings from Google, Microsoft, Apple, Meta, Amazon, Oracle, Tesla, Palantir, IBM, etc. Maybe you can see why I'm a skeptic, but who knows? I could be wrong. Maybe OpenAI really is worth $150 million per engineer. After all, NVIDIA, the world's most valuable company, has an estimated valuation per engineer for 2025 in the range of $160 to $245 million per engineer. But then NVIDIA is obscenely profitable on $148.5 billion in trailing 12-month revenue. You get the idea. OpenAI is priced for perfection. Well, Mark Zuckerberg has apparently tossed in the towel in Meta's quest for AGI, abandoning the current effort after withering criticism in April when outside researchers discovered that benchmarks for its new Llama AI model were designed to make the products look more capable than they actually were, suggesting an attempt to conceal poor performance. I discussed that here on the pod several months ago. Now, Meta plans to create a new artificial intelligence research lab dedicated to pursuing, quote, superintelligence, and is reported to be in advanced talks to invest up to $14 billion into Scale AI and hire the startup's chief executive, Alexander Wang. The deal would be one of Meta's largest ever investments. As part of the proposed deal, which is still being finalized, other Scale AI employees would join Meta alongside Wang as part of a new effort to develop advanced AI called superintelligence. Meta has reportedly also offered compensation packages worth 7 to 9 figures to dozens of researchers from other companies like OpenAI and Google, according to the New York Times, with some already agreeing to join the company. And then, just in time to save us all, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD, has released something interesting and badly needed: AI capability indicators. Developed over 5 years by a collaboration of some 50 experts, the indicators are designed to assess and compare AI advancements against 9 human abilities, ranging from language to manipulation. Their idea is to create a standardized framework for understanding what AI can actually do compared to human abilities. Each ability is scaled from level 1, which is basic problem solving, to level 5, which is full human equivalence. Their assessment indicates that current AI systems are clustered around levels 2 and 3 across most capabilities and struggle with analytical reasoning and persist in confidently stating nonsense. What does this mean for business? Well, when a sales rep promises their AI solution will revolutionize your operations, you can now ask which capability levels their system actually achieves and in which specific domains, using the OECD scale as a reference standard. That's a challenge for most salespeople. The gap analysis between current AI capabilities and the requirements of specific business tasks becomes clearer when standard benchmarks are used. The framework also reveals opportunities that might not be immediately obvious. Areas where AI performs at levels 3 or higher represent genuine automation potential, while level 2 capabilities suggest less powerful augmentation opportunities. The OECD's systematic approach provides a path for strategic planning as well. That's a clear picture of what breakthrough capabilities we should be monitoring. The jump from level 3 to level 4 across multiple domains would represent a genuine inflection point, particularly in areas like creative problem solving and social intelligence. Especially revealing is how the framework illuminates the interconnectedness of different capabilities. For example, true robotic intelligence requires simultaneous advances across multiple domains, such as vision, manipulation, social interaction, and problem solving. So it's essentially a report card for the AI age. Instead of being caught up in the hype, there is now a framework for systematically tracking progress and understanding real-world implications. It provides a common language for communicating about AI capabilities and a systematic way to track progress that everyone can understand and use. And then, for those dreading the advent of Skynet, take solace in the fact that current AI is basically pattern recognition at scale and speed, with no actual reasoning capability. The title of a fresh paper from Apple in the journal Speech and Natural Language Processing says it all. Quote, "The illusion of thinking." In it, a half-dozen top researchers probed reasoning models, that is, large language models that, quote, think about problems longer and across many steps, from the leading AI labs, including OpenAI, DeepSeek, and Anthropic. They found little evidence that these are capable of reasoning anywhere close to the level their makers claim. It turns out that the average 6-year-old has more common sense than the best AI, with no real prospects for changing that paradigm in the foreseeable future. Next, the quantum supremacy. IBM has announced plans last Tuesday to build the world's first large-scale fault-tolerant quantum computer, setting the stage for practical and scalable quantum computing. The IBM Quantum Starling, as it's called, will be built in a new IBM Quantum Data Center in Poughkeepsie, New York for delivery by 2029 and is expected to perform 20,000 times more operations than today's quantum computers. For comparison, the computational state of an IBM Starling would require the memory of more than 1,048 of the world's most powerful supercomputers. IBM is also releasing a new quantum roadmap that outlines the key technology milestones that will demonstrate and execute the criteria for fault tolerance, a blistering development pace for quantum. And finally, NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang is now bullish about quantum computing, reforming his naysaying ways, and he now expects quantum computing will start solving real-world problems in the coming years. During his keynote speech at NVIDIA's GTC Paris Developer Conference this past Wednesday, Huang declared, quote, "Quantum computing is reaching an inflection point," close quote. And now let's take a brief look up to space tech. Aerospace company Jet Zero has been pitching a spacious, fuel-efficient, blended wing airplane for years, and now they appear to have the capital to build it. The company said it would invest nearly $5 billion beginning next year at a manufacturing plant in Greensboro, North Carolina, and employ more than 14,500 workers. Jet Zero has been working with the U.S. Air Force for years to develop the Z4, the blended wing plane design, a first for commercial passengers. Some 15 airlines have been advising Jet Zero as part of an airline working group, and Alaska Airlines as well as United have invested in the startup. United plans to order up to 200 of its planes. They predict commercial use by 2032. No small feat to create something new that takes 10 years and billions in CapEx. And on to the venture economy. I've talked previously about legislative efforts to redefine the accredited investor to become more inclusive. Well, apparently the SEC is considering loosening its own rules, barring retail investors from private funds. After changing close-end fund guidance last month, this past week, Natasha Vij-Greener, the director of the SEC's Investment Management Division, said it could take additional steps to make private funds more accessible by considering loosening long-standing rules that restrict private equity investments to institutions and wealthy people to broaden access to a fast-growing asset class. The agency is reportedly working with money managers that want to offer private fund of funds to ordinary investors through SEC-regulated vehicles to determine what sort of disclosure these funds might need to make. And then more good news on the IPO front. Voyager Technologies raised $382.8 million in its U.S. IPO offering in a bull market for military spending. The company, which provides mission-critical space and defense technology solutions, along with some investors, sold roughly 12.4 million shares at $31 a share, above its marketed range of 26 to 29. And also, Chime completed its IPO, despite a lower valuation from its peak in the private market. Chime priced its IPO at $27 a share, giving it a fully diluted market cap of $11.6 billion, a 54% discount from the company's peak $25 billion valuation in 2021. Chime closed its first day of trading on the NASDAQ at a little over $37 a share, which was a 37% bump over its IPO offering price, suggesting growing acceptance of the now common down round IPO. And then a quick mention of the cryptoverse. Regular listeners will recall my previous comments on the pod about the maturing of stablecoins in transaction processing. Well, when you get into Walmart, you've definitely arrived in U.S. commerce. And Walmart, Amazon, and other multinational giants are apparently exploring whether to issue their own stablecoins in the U.S. Stablecoin payments by Walmart or Amazon that bypass the traditional payment system would likely send a collective shudder through U.S. banks and card network giants. With huge networks of customers, terabits of data, and far lighter regulations, retail and technology companies are becoming real threats to banks. The retailer's final decision will apparently depend on the Genius Act, which is proposed legislation that would launch a regulatory framework for stablecoins. The bill recently passed several procedural hurdles, but still needs to pass both a House and Senate vote. Walmart has long sought to become a player in financial services, where it could leverage its network of millions of weekly customers, and has already entered into the industry through its fintech unit. Stablecoins would allow merchants to circumvent the traditional payment system and their billions of dollars in fees each year when customers make purchases using their bank cards. And bank card payments typically take days to settle, while stablecoins offer the possibility for near instantaneous settlement. This could be of particular interest to merchants with suppliers located abroad. Merchants have previously attempted to launch payment alternatives to disintermediate the card-based system dominated by Visa and MasterCard, though most of those have failed to gain traction. Now, it seems Visa and MasterCard are facing a reckoning with the Genius Act. And now, on to my interview with Karl Rabago, an independent electric utility and grid expert, to talk about energy demand versus supply for data centers and how it can affect the entrepreneurial success of data center developers.
Rolling South is raising a new fund focused exclusively on the South's premier technology accelerator, ATDC. Join us to invest in the best technology businesses in the world. Go to rollingsouth.vc to learn more.
So I'd like to welcome Karl Rabago. He's the principal at Rabago Energy, which is focused on consulting and advisory services in the electricity sector, and particularly specializing in clean and smart energy. He has over 35 years experience in clean energy, electricity regulation, sustainability, and advocacy, and has served as a public utility commissioner, a federal research and development executive, utility executive, an advocate, and an attorney. He has more than 180 expert witness testimony filings under his belt. So he's a go-to guy for information about the power industry. Welcome, Karl.
Thank you, David. It's a pleasure to be with you today.
I want to thank you for sharing your time with us and shining the light on some of these challenges that are coming in the power industry relevant to data center development. And it's particularly timely given some of the recent deals we've seen with Meta contracting with dedicated nuclear power and with the Colossus data center in Tennessee having behind the meter power generation. So those are separate issues and raise all kinds of questions. And so I'm interested in your perspective about all these things. And I talk pretty regularly about these variables that affect the AI data center efficiency, including not just the dynamics of algorithmic efficiency. So how efficient the software algorithms are determines to some degree the power demand. And then the data transmission, so sending information back and forth between users, that's a power consumption factor. And then one of the things I recently learned and want to understand more about is the process of forecasting demand for these data centers, and then the data centers securing power commitments for AI data center developments, both on and off the grid. And that's kind of turned into the Wild West. So can you explain the process and what the problems are that we're facing today?
Sure. There's a couple of things going on here that make this a bit difficult. Number one is there's a lack of transparency. We don't have any uniform way of understanding what's going on, what proposals are being made. There's been several articles appearing that it appears data center developers wisely shop multiple utilities with the same concepts. And what appears to be high data center demand may, at least in part, be multiple asks for the same facility. So we've got widespreads in what a utility focuses on and has to serve, because they have an obligation to serve if you want to use utility power. That other discussion we can deal with separately. And the utilities are rightfully uncertain. They generally can't charge rates unless they have cost. They don't want to build generation for new data center load if the data center decides to go with that other utility, because somebody's going to have to pay for it. So we have a chicken and egg kind of problem here, a timing problem. You know, a data center would ideally like to have a commitment. If I come, will you provide me power? Yes, we will, is the answer that's preferred. But the utility will have to say, well, it depends. If I need to build extra power, there may be conditions tied to it. I may have to go to a regulator to get permission to do it. I may be able to not move that fast. Then there's allocation problems with all the other customers who bear some of those costs, et cetera, et cetera. So we've got a very fast-moving, innovative world meeting a very stable, slow-moving world. Utilities tend to focus backwards. Data centers tend to focus forwards. And so we also have just a temporal mismatch in the way these things are addressed. So, what do we know? We know that we don't know as much as we'd like to know to make perfect decisions. And what we do know is that data center load is attractive to the utilities. It's called high load factor load. It means these data centers turn on and they run pretty much uniformly for every minute of every hour of every day. And that's the stuff utilities love. Every manufacturer would like a steady stream of products, right? Delivery.
Mm-hmm.
So that's nice. And it adds value and it can help pay some of the costs of the embedded grid, and as long as the load is there. And that's the last big issue, which is that utilities have been stung before by industrial proposals to add load that then evaporate. Think much smaller scale. Think of a big box retail store that comes in, dominates, the development opportunities in a community, and then decides to shut down. And all the infrastructure that went with making that possible still has to get paid for. Who's going to pay for it? It's the worry about those kinds of things that makes some people hesitant, but it's the attractiveness of the load that makes some people exuberant. And we have a conflict of those things going on that is coloring the size and the shape of the forecast that we see.
Yeah, I'm interested in the forecasting a little bit. There's this scenario going on where the developers have what sound like agents that make their proposal to the power providers, as you mentioned, in different markets, and maybe
Yes.
even different power proposals in the same market masked as different businesses in order to create a flow of regulatory offerings so that when the developer is ready to do a deal, there's a deal to be made rather than having to wait for the evaluation and the estimates and all of the stuff the power company has to do to determine how much power they can provide and what CapEx they need to sink into the deal. And so these developers have the opportunity to bail out of these deals. And then that leaves the power company in the situation where they're holding the bag. They've tried to predict power demand based on these requests, and the requests are disappearing because it's not fitting into the developer's timeline. And so it's creating havoc. And so,
Yep.
what do you see in that realm?
You're describing broadly what's referred to as the phantom load problem, that
Uh-huh.
it says it's going to be a load, but then it turns out to evaporate. And part of it is a legacy problem. Utilities in most places do some kind of planning process, and they plan by extrapolating from 20-year historical trends, which is crazy in a world where the weather is changing so rapidly. But it's backward looking and then extrapolated forward. Data centers have the ability to bring on such big chunks of load that it doesn't fit within those historically based forecasts. So now you're deviating from the plan, which was carefully tailored, even had sensitivities and alternative scenarios. Data center load, if it's as big as it looks, and it's not phantom load, is so big that it blows all the plans out of the water. And now we're asking a very unnimble industry, the utility industry, to react with nimbleness so that they can secure these opportunities. And if they do, and they didn't think it through all the way, there's going to be a bag that somebody is going to have to hold. And remember, utilities are in this for the long haul. They will probably tell you they assume they'll be here long after the data centers have been replaced by something out of science fiction. But they'll plan to still be here, providing people with electricity. So playing the long game countenances them not being too exuberant in playing to the data center load. We'll build you anything and then you come. By the way, regulation of utilities doesn't work like that. They can't get a power plant approved usually without a rigorous approval process, and then it has to be put into rates. So it has to be prudent it has to meet regulatory requirements. That alone makes it hard to respond to the data center boom, if you will.
Yeah.
So we're mixing two different kinds of approaches on service and technology, and there are going to be some messes in the middle. Somebody's going to overbuild, somebody's not going to respond quickly enough. And the real question is whether, as you said, on the data center side, is there really all that demand out there?
Yeah. Well, on the demand scenario, I'm interested in your perspective on two predictions that have been publicly made for 2030 power demand increase. One by Schneider Electric that predicted a 16.5 to 65.5 gigawatt increase in demand, whereas the Rand Corporation analyzed the same data and they came up with a forecast of 347 gigawatt increase in demand. So a 20x difference. So
Yeah,
what do you make of that kind of variability in prediction of power demand going forward?
there's got to be four things going on there, right? One is, what are your assumptions? And if you're assuming that every ask or soundbite or press release, that says, like I read some in Montana, we're starting with a 50 megawatt letter of intent, and it could be followed by 250 megawatts more. The first part is not even a contract. The second part is just a soundbite. If you score that as 300 instead of as 50, you're on your way to hyperinflation of the estimates. So what is your assumption? Is everything that comes out of the mouth of the data center trade journals or a data center developer trustworthy? And how do you even examine it, given that there's probably lots of business confidential information behind it? There's also an overlapping data problem. As you said, if you're shopping in multiple jurisdictions or with multiple entities that are in fact the same entity, you may have no way of disaggregating that data and finding out what's real. And you want to be prudent and account for everything you might need to do. That translates into a lack of transparency. Nobody's required to say specifically and publicly what they're going to do. And certainly, those statements are not backed up with financial penalties or anything that would make it a bad idea to puff things up. And that's really what it comes down to in the end. There's no penalty for puffery in this space. And there, in fact, are some pretty good advantages to the kind of behavior when you want to secure not only a site, not only the construction, but a long-term stream of steady, affordable electricity in order to serve the ultimate data center tenants' needs. Just take everything with a grain of salt, and I wouldn't even split them down the middle. We also have a dynamic going on, as we always have with very large customers, that we're talking about negotiating a price for the technology as I propose to construct it, right? And getting a good deal from the local provider, from the local county for permitting and taxes and all the deals you try to get as a developer. If you're good at it, you can probably end up at the bottom end of all those costs and have a viable project. But if you can't, or if the prices are really indistinguishable from place to place, a technology-based business like data centers is going to have to look at things like, are we deploying the most advanced energy efficiency measures? Have we negotiated with the utility for the best possible terms and expressed a willingness to have flexibility in our loads? Are we willing, as you mentioned earlier on too, are we willing to invest in some behind the meter generation to have on-site insurance against the economic uncertainty or the technological uncertainty of the utility's ability to deliver the power at rates we can afford? So negotiating, getting deals is the easy path if you can do it. But the other path is also self-help, fixing some of these things, or insuring against some of these risks on your own. And I'm sure data center people are thinking about it. But if I can do it with a handshake, I'll do it with that rather than installing, an expensive self-generation facility.
Yeah. Well, One of my favorite sages is Warren Buffett's sidekick, Charlie Munger, who is famous for saying that show me the incentives and I'll show you the behavior. And so, what are the incentives that you see driving the data center developers versus the power industry incentives and then the grid operators? Because the power industry and
Right.
the grid operators are not always the same, although they frequently are. And
Yes.
and do these incentives align or are they misaligned?
At some level, everybody participating in a communal network is good for everyone. There is a component of universality to us all being part of the same system, right? You've got a big load. It could take it if it takes its share of the cost and helps support the system, that spreads the cost for you and me. You think about it, we put in telephone lines in this country, not just so that the farmer could call the doctor and say, I'm feeling really bad, but it also saved us money because the doctor could say, sounds to me like you have a headache, take 2 aspirin and call me back tomorrow. And the doctor didn't have to drive all the way out to the farm to see his patient, right? So network effects are valuable. This universality is valuable. But there is a difference in several ways. I've already touched on some. Innovation versus steadiness, innovation on behalf of the tech sector, steadiness, security, lack of just glitz on the part of the utilities. There's speed is therefore, the good developer gets this deal locked down as fast as possible and does not impede all the other steps in the data center ultimate operational objectives, right? Utilities have never really been hurt for taking their time, and as a result, there's a culture of careful consideration. I'm now 3 months into waiting for my utility to move the wire from my house to my new garage.
Sort of antithetical to the mindset of developers who,
Can you
yesterday is too
imagine?
late.
Yes. Can you imagine that just like, what? How do you do this? Right? There is at least nominally a difference in selfishness. Data centers are properly focused, the developers are properly focused on getting the facility built and wired up. And then they're focused on getting paid by the ultimate tenant. If there's a difference between those two, the utility ostensibly, but also very importantly to the people who work for utilities, having been one of those people, this commitment to providing universal service, to providing a public service and not a private service, does color the way they approach problems. Finally, the existence of that unknown variable, the regulator, and also increasingly a lot of places, state legislators who are getting in the game, who see themselves as, focused on economics, trying to grow jobs, trying to help the utility sell more electricity, but at the same time, they're the ones who receive the calls when a customer says, my bill just went up because the utility said they had to construct a new power plant for, this tech company or that tech company. So that regulatory legislative oversight factor is much more significant for the utility than the independent competitive actor who is on the tech side of that equation. And that really makes for a difference in how they approach the best way to solve this problem.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I talk about fairly frequently is a variability in the demand for power based on the functionality of the data center. So this relates to the efficiency of the processors, the efficiency of the algorithms, and also the need for cooling and the temporal demand so that you may have fewer customers at 3 in the morning than you do at 3 in the afternoon. And that all leads to variability in power demand that you don't read about a lot. And also, you don't read about in terms of data centers, the requirement for a data center to process a certain amount of data or run an AI model may de escalate over time or as it becomes more efficient. And so the whole footprint becomes smaller. That's a real possible scenario. So
talk a little bit about the consequences of underestimating demand leading to a shortage of electrons, which is the thing most talked about, that would likely lead to increasing power prices and downstream escalation of AI costs. But what about overestimating the power demand leading to overcapacity for electrons? That could negatively affect the power market and the data center developers, causing them to go out of business. They have to commit to these long-term power arrangements. And so how do you see that shaking out, the consequences for under or overestimating demand?
If I was a data center developer and ultimate, tenant, I would want to transfer all that risk to the utility. And I would make an argument, if they hired me to make the argument for them, I'd make the argument that, well, yes, we are big, but we're not the whole. And you have the tools, the resources, the regulatory authority, and the authorized rates to manage that. That's your job. You take care of that. Do I have to make a contribution in aid of that? Well, sure. You have to invest a certain amount of infrastructure to safely connect your center to the grid. You might have to accept some terms and conditions on how you operate a charge if your load ends up having a low load factor, meaning it's highly variable and during different hours of the year. There may be charges that the utility can impose on the data center to address that. But by and large, if I was in the data center business, I'd say, you're the monopoly. That's what you get paid for. You manage upside and downside risk. That's what you've been doing for 100 years. Let me just run my business, a competitive data center business. What are the consequences? Well, assuming they get away with that, right? Assuming they get away with transferring it, and they'd be bad negotiations if they didn't try to transfer as much as risk as possible to the other party in the transaction, right? And by the way, utilities are pushing back the other way. I just filed testimony on the large load factor customer tariff that Florida Power is proposing for its data centers. They're trying to manage it by limiting the places and terms under which data centers can connect. They said, well, here's places where we already have infrastructure, and you can hook up here without big incremental cost. That's one way to manage that, to say, look, we got abundant wires and power plants or power plant sites in these 3 counties or 5 counties or whatever it is. Please consider your data center siting there. Otherwise, and in addition, if we have to build anything, we're going to put a separate charge on for you. Now, that might be, you might amortize that out and say you'll be finished paying in 20 years, or you might have an exit fee. That's what happens when the utility pushes the risk back, right? And what will happen is this will go in front of the regulators, and the regulators will decide where on that continuum of data center accepts all the risk or utility accepts all the risk, they will come down. And having been a regulator, I will tell you that most of these issues end up in the manner of Solomon, the babe. Yeah. So
Dividing the
um,
baby.
it is, and it with more information. In the defense of slicing up that baby, with more information, you can make a judgment about what it's reasonable to impose on business as a business cost and what it's reasonable to impose on the utility as a utility cost. The thing to remember is that imposing a cost on a utility, and this weighs heavily on regulators if they're doing their job, is that the backstop for the utility bearing the cost is all the other customers.
Well, what about the issue, just sort of backing up and taking a bigger view of this overall problem? What about the issue of behind the meter power development for AI data centers affecting the power market indirectly or directly and affecting the grid? So you have something like Colossus where they're generating, I don't know how many megawatts, but a lot to power this huge data center they have in Tennessee. And surely that's affecting the grid because it has to be connected. I mean, I don't know that it is, but it has to be to
I have to
compensate
assume.
for under or over power that they're generating. And so that's going to have an effect on the grid. the grid manager is going to have to manage that. There's all kinds of implications for that, and for the power companies that contribute to that grid. So how does that work?
Yeah, so it's not all a problem. It could be really beneficial. And I've been advocating for more customer autonomy and empowerment in terms of behind the meter solutions for 30 years now. I think data centers and the people who have been advocating for rooftop solar and energy efficiency and all that have great common cause in that regard. And I think it's more in line with the way our country is supposed to operate, right? If I can choose a competitive solution and we can slowly whittle down the operation of a monopoly, which is supposed to be anathema to our capitalistic economy, then we're all doing well. So I cheer the idea of these behind the meter solutions. As you said, behind the meter generation or batteries so they can ride through some things, and the efficiency measures of adding, better cooling and all those sorts of things are things that not only do they give optionality and control to the data center operator, but they allow them to be better customers on the grid, right? I mean, if they're coming, you either deal with them as this massive, unexpected, unplanned for, sudden jolt of demand that you have to serve with all the potential variability they have, or we encourage them to be the smartest, smoothest, friendliest load the system will ever get by deploying a bunch of options on their side of the meter. Then they start looking like data microgrids, which are capable of running themselves. That's helpful if you're subject to extreme weather outages on the grid at large. Anybody with that big a load connected in parallel to the grid wants the ability to continue operating if the main grid goes down. So you could have some real win-win-wins here. You could have a win for the competitive power services business. You have a win for the data center who has superior power services on their site. And you have a win for the utility who has one of the prettiest customers in the entire beauty contest. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
So I like going down that path. Now, monopolists gonna monopolize. They don't like losing control more than anything. They don't like losing the opportunity to profit off of installing that equipment and operating it, or effectively doing so from a distance. They don't like the theoretical risk that the data center won't operate its equipment properly. Their default response will be, we got to monopolize, but that should be resisted. And I'm glad to get my own placard and march with the data centers to say, give us some autonomy as customers, because I think they could really help make the grid get better, not worse.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, what about the scenario where a data center becomes stranded without power? Is that possible going forward in this scenario? And what are the implications for such a scenario where you're stranded without power for 12 hours or a day or longer?
It should be possible. It's possible for us. So, just as any other customer, one can imagine a scenario in which the utility has to process rolling brownouts or blackouts to deal with the grid emergency. It's much harder to restart a load as big as a data center. So, just from the economics and engineering perspective, the utility will want to keep them up and deal with smaller loads like me by turning me off or dimming me down. So data centers stand in a pretty good position to maintain power quality. And you could even imagine reciprocal obligations in return for the rates that data centers have to pay, that utilities will meet certain reliability criteria and learn to be a little competitive and a little bit more innovative and responsive to customers. That's utilities learning to do that. That would also be a net positive for society. For the utility thinking about the old joke about, when it was the Bell system, you can have any phone you want as long as it's black and rotary dial, right? We see where
Yeah.
that business went. Utilities need to take a step in the direction of these kinds of loads because it's not like we're not going to have them, and learn how to work well with them in a way that is a win-win for everyone. But ultimately speaking, shedding load is what is necessary in a live dynamic grid that's supposed to stay within a few tenths of a percentage of points of 60 hertz in frequency. And as we saw with things like Winter Storm Uri, where the Texas ERCOT grid was seconds away from a total meltdown that would have shut the entire grid down, there are times when you have to say, sorry, you're going without power. It's up
Yeah.
to the data center to calculate the likelihood, the risk, and the cost of that pattern of behavior or that likelihood of that event, and then start evaluating what are the costs of those remedial mitigating measures, like the batteries, like the self-generation, like load management, all the other things that you and I would do.
Yeah.
For me, I got a Lightning in the garage. I'm going to buy a generator transfer switch. If I had to have an extended outage here in my neighborhood, I would switch to my truck, turn down all my other loads, and keep my food cold in the refrigerator. Data
Standard
centers need that.
homeowner approach.
Right. It's just a matter of scale for the utility.
Yeah. There's one more scenario I'm interested in your thoughts about, and that's where the data center has a long-term contract for power with the power provider. But then over that long term, the price of electrons drops significantly for whatever reason. So, do you expect contracts to accommodate that, or do you feel like there's going to be turmoil over this, the price, if it's a fixed price?
If I was a data center, I'd absolutely negotiate for the reset on prices. There's a benefit to some stability because you can factor that in, and it may, while it's a big part of O&M costs, operating and maintenance costs 30 to 60% range, depending on what's going on in the data center. It's not the only cost, right? And so having some stability in those rates, and when I dealt with, the tech guys when I was in Austin, that's what they said. But they didn't want these rates to get stale and go out of market. And so you need a mechanism for a relook that can be negotiated. It should be a feature of the tariffs so that they can take advantage of those falling prices, falling average prices. They can take advantage of the fact that some of the infrastructure has been paid off, and the charge shouldn't continue in perpetuity. Once you've paid for your interconnection, once you've paid for the upgrade to the transmission line, whatever it is, then that should disappear. So it's perfectly reasonable that these rates be somewhat dynamic and that they be subject to review in rate cases.
Yeah, typically rates are dynamic for the power producer on the upside.
Yes, and I hope for your vision of a world in which rates are falling. It's really hard for utilities to make that happen, both financially and sort of attitudinally, because they've promised their investors, 4 to 6% increase in earnings on an average annual compounded basis. So they're going to be resistant to passing through those reductions. And unfortunately, they have a lot of tricks to play with making sure that they continue to increase their earnings. But having been in so many of these cases, having sat in settlement talks and as a regulator with so many industrial type customers or their representatives, here's what starry-eyed optimistic Karl would like. What I'd like is that we could figure out a way that little customers or the people that represent little customers and large customers could join forces to make the utility business better, more responsive, more innovative, more technology friendly, more competitive, more supportive of competition. Unfortunately, right now, most of the game that's played is a who gets how much of the pie game in terms of benefits and who gets how much of the costs.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never forget when I was in New York and doing rate cases with Con Ed. You got like the New York Housing Authority buys all the power for housing authority properties, and they wanted the best deal They wanted the biggest slice of the pie from the utility. And so they actually stood on opposite sides sometimes of the individual customers who were identical to the customers they served in housing authority projects, but who happened to be renting or had their own homes. Because the more goodies they got, the less goodies somebody else did.
I see.
Together we would be a force for real positive transformation in the utility industry, but we keep getting sidetracked by arguing amongst ourselves how this goes. And in the course of this conversation, I've pointed out 2 or 3 different ways that we actually have common cause and could make the system better for everyone.
Yeah, that's very interesting perspective. And there's a lot that's going to happen, I think, over the next few years. And so we may want to have you come back here in 6 months and talk about some of the things that have happened in the interval that might clarify the market. So thank you, Karl, for your time and your expertise. I really appreciate it.
David, I very much enjoyed this conversation. I could think of nothing more fun than having another one. So I appreciate the possibility of it happening. And you're right, we'll know more. You know what they say that old curse is, right? May you live in interesting times. We all certainly do. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Karl.
Thank you for listening. Visit us at ventureinthesouth.com for a complete list of previous and future shows.